Friends, good evening and welcome again. This is week two, though if you missed last week, you haven't you're still in good shape and still at the beginning of sorts. But this is week two of our study of the book of Romans and talking about the why of the book. And I want to make room for a couple things as we get started. This is I am slightly more academic, maybe 15% more professorial than I sometimes am, which hey, that might be a lot. And I don't want that to not make room. In fact, um, part of the reason that we're going about this study in this way and being a little bit methodical about the way that we peel things back and begin to look into it. Part of the reason behind it is because Romans itself is that kind of text. We were speaking a moment ago before the recording started about how there is a book by N.T. Wright that explores the book of Romans. And Wright's not the only one, that there are so many people who in a desire to unfold or understand more about the Bible broadly, that they've decided that Romans is a good and important place to lean in. That's not an accident. It's because and we covered some of this last week, but this is Paul's effort to really pull it all together. And we're going to go further into our material in just a moment here, but just as a way of an overview, Paul, who is responsible for so much of Christian theology, responsible for so much of the New Testament. There are even people who wrote and pretended to be Paul, and that's how influential he was and his name was and continues to be. That Paul used all of his old tricks, all of his familiar tools of talking to churches and building them up and offering theological reflection to them, but used it in a new place with a church that was not his church, was not the church that he planted. And yet he felt they needed a word from him and a pastoral spirit from him. He first intended to write to them and then intended to visit, though we don't think that he ever got to fully make that visit. He died at somewhere along the course of his third missionary journey. Church legend has all sorts of ideas around it, but we know that Paul lived and served and died with trying to preach this particular message. And in particular, when we talk about what Paul is after here, Romans, if it's about anything, it's about righteousness. And we can we're going to lean into this a little bit, but there's a verse that is really the crux of it. If the earliest part of Romans, this is the part that folks are often familiar with. Romans 1:16 reads, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." This word unashamed or not ashamed is going to be really important. So I want you to think for a moment about shame. What are the circumstances, the situations that evoke shame in us, that create shame in us, and why is it so important that Paul, in his exploration of the gospel, that he begins not by saying God is good, that God is kind, that God is loving, that God creates love in me, but the first place he goes on this exploration of God's righteousness is first to say, I am unashamed. I think this ends up being really important. But it says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Sometimes you'll see this language to the Greek, other times you'll hear to the Gentile. We are right to hear this in very insider outsider language, right? Either us or them, either you are this or you are that. Even in contemporary language, our Jewish siblings will talk about the Jews or the goyim, right? It's everyone else who's not inside, and this same sort of stark inside outside experience is what Paul is dealing with. He says. The gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed. The righteousness of God is revealed, not created, not magnified, not amplified, not inserted in after the fact. It's revealed, this thing that was already there, that's already existing. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. What does that mean? Paul is on some big rhetorical flourishes. And here's what makes reading Romans beautiful but tricky. Sometimes Paul is trying to offer some deep, nuanced theological depth. And sometimes Paul is just writing his tail off, and we don't always know what he's after. And so that's why it takes some of the more intentional reflection of it. I would say that this actually does mean something. Through faith, for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. And so I want to finish setting us up here for a second. If you have questions or things I can clarify in a second, I'm happy for them. But this idea, and the one that we'll spend some time on, the most time on, is this idea of righteousness, this idea of God's righteousness that exists somewhere, somehow. And this idea of the gospel has something to do with unveiling or revealing it. And as Paul says, first for the Jew and also for the Greek. And so he spends the next 15 chapters unpacking what he means by the righteousness, and in particular the righteousness of God. So we're gonna dive in a minute. But any big questions or clarifications, anything to speak to before we keep leaning in? Okay. I'm about to have fun. I hope that I believe y'all will also. This is some interesting things. There's some interesting pieces of scripture. I would encourage, if you can, assuming you're not like driving, listening to this, that I'd encourage you to open up your Bibles and be able to read these passages as we're going, and maybe even a little bit back and forward, mostly in and out of Romans 1 and 2 in this moment. This word, this Greek word, dikaios. I won't keep using it, mostly because it's awkward and it means righteousness. And as much as we want we understand that we're diving into the original language, unpacking and understanding it is as much our work in English as it was their work in Greek. But to give the context for this word, righteousness, it's used 60 times in the book of Romans alone. It's so much of how he is trying to unpack and understand the world. A little bit of a recap for Paul in a moment here, but so for let's see if I can read this slide. Did not enough clearly as I wanted to. So the three pieces, I don't know if you can see this fully in the Hebrew root of this idea of righteousness. It does a few different things, and it works on a few different levels. It means generally to be in right relationship, but it's the same word that we use when we talk about a covenant relationship with God. We first see this in terms of temple relationships, relationships between God and king, God and holy leadership of Israel. It's there's a holy relationship, and there's also a capacity for correction or repair, understanding that at some point, someone, not God, but someone's going to do something wrong and is going to need some kind of repair work or reconnection. When we come to see it in the New Testament, the way that it's often used is an attribute of God, the way that God is, not like not an attribute of God, like God has curly hair and also righteousness, right? It's not like a happenstance attribute of God. It's a core, a foundational way that God is in the world. So in the Hebrew Bible, we would see that God's righteousness is connected with these mandates for when you gather from your field, leave the edges so others can glean, and so that if there are people who are hungry, that there won't be hungry people. These mandates in the Hebrew Bible around caring for widows and orphans and the strangers, right? Like the loud throated justice voice in the Hebrew Bible is rooted not in God's like afterthought, happenstance, preference, but in this foundational understanding that God is righteousness. It is how God it is who God is. And so for Paul, here's what we really want to peel apart and what ends up being important. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing for just a quick second and talk maybe you'll get sick of me talking about anti-Semitism, but it's really, really important to try to name and understand that it has existed in Christian uh, history and theology, and it's written in, it's etched across the lens through which we view our own faith. Because it has been so prevalent. And so, if we don't do the careful work of seeing it, acknowledging it, moving around it, then we risk further buying into it. And so we are going to talk a lot about um, Jews and Jewishness and Jewish identity as different and separate from this early Christian identity. But before we do that, we have to understand a few things. One, Jesus was Jewish. This might seem obvious. I know y'all are smart. Jesus was Jewish, and it's worth thinking about, right, and acknowledging that part of his identity, because all of these people who are writing and reading, all of them know that and understand that. Moreover, Paul is Jewish, not was Jewish, not was Jewish until he fell off that horse on the road to Damascus and was blinded and spoken to by the Lord and had this conversion experience and accepted Jesus Christ as Lord. He did all of that. He is a follower of Jesus, but he never revokes his Jewishness or Jewish identity. And so, yes, Jesus was Jewish, and yes, Paul was Jewish, but moreover, uh, they, Paul himself and early Christians, his big challenge and some of the victory of his own ministry is that we do not see the Jewishness of early Christians as making them lesser than or substantively different than the converts from other spaces. Most of the early converts were Jewish, right? And we know there's lots of conflict over this. I say all of this for this reason. When we read Romans, and I'd encourage you read swaths of it. It's possible to read Romans and read in it a condemnation of Jews or Jewishness. But if we read that, I would offer to you that is not what's actually in the text. That is our own learned anti-Semitism that sometimes gets in etched on the glass that we view. Paul doesn't pit Jewishness against Christianity in Romans. And if you think he does, I would challenge you to go back and look and read, because for every moment where he says anything even somewhat critical of Judaism, he says more in defense of. He paints a world not where Judaism is this old thing that's going to be superseded, but instead he says Judaism and the law, the structure of the law that God gave to the Jewish people, is the means by which righteousness came to them and that people. And grace through Jesus Christ is the way that God's righteousness is offered up and available to everyone else. But we would be remiss to say it's only about the way that righteousness is offered up through Jesus. Paul emphasizes and is emphatic. No, 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 no. We have to understand that first righteousness came through the law and then came through Jesus. And in order to understand them fully, we have to understand them together. And so when we look at these pieces together, we have to see that righteousness, as we've learned to hear it, as we've learned to study it, often it sounds like we have to be morally perfect. We've got to somehow be this perfect person, but also that high bar ends up being very transactional, right? Either you are perfect or you're nothing or you're out. And in reality, for Paul's understanding of God's righteousness is the ability to create right relationship in any circumstance. Right? So God's righteousness can go in anywhere. Can it go in and work through the law that we find in the Hebrew Bible? Yes, it can. Can it go and can it work through grace, through Jesus Christ? Yes, it can. Can it go and work as we learn that Paul went to Greek communities in Mars Hill and the Arapagos, and through the tribute to the unknown God, found a way to tell them about Jesus and grace and truth? Was that a means and method for righteousness to come to those people? Yes, it was. For Paul, God's righteousness is bigger than the categories we want to put it into. And for every time we might want to limit it, put it in a box, we might want to say it only shows up in these ways, in these places. For Paul, it simply is not. And so the best news in his understanding of Jesus' work isn't that Jesus brought a new kind of righteousness, but that he made the righteousness that Paul and others had known through the law, that he found a way to offer it to others, to the Gentiles, to anyone who might desire it, and then offers up this idea that it's not exclusive. And so for Paul, we talked before about these three different missionary journeys he went on. These Paul almost died a lot before he actually died. Right? Paul got shipwrecked. Paul was in and out of jail a whole lot. Paul was not the reputable person that your parents would want you to speak to, right? But Paul did all of this because on a very basic level, he understood if this righteousness is not exclusive, if it's not just for a limited group of people, then we have a duty to tell everybody about it. We have a duty to offer this understanding of righteousness, this welcome, this good news to anyone who's willing to listen, because we believe that wholeheartedly, that that is what the righteousness of God is for. It is for everyone, and it's for everyone to experience. Let me pause. I'm curious what if questions, comments, anything standing out. Any ideas standing out in this moment?
Um, may I say something?
Please.
Um, one of the teaching at a Christian college means that sometimes you want to have lessons that you bring out in class. And so that, like in math class, that might be kind of hard sometimes. And but there was a moment in class where I could always bring this up,
Mm.
and it was the I'd visited Carl Sandburg's home and and done a tour and then watched a video, and he's being interviewed by someone, and he's being asked what is the worst word in the English language,
Hmm.
and he said exclusive.
Hmm.
Exclusive is the worst word in the English language. And I could always tie that to this lesson that we were talking about. The illustration is that we were on Jekyll Island and visited St. Simon's Island down near Georgia. And Jekyll Island is like the whole place is a park. I mean, there are people that live there, but it's it's open. You can always get to the beach from
Hmm.
anywhere, and nobody has beach exclusive rights. But if you go
Hmm.
to St. Simon's Island, it's you can't get there from anywhere. It's everybody owns a piece of the beach.
Ah,
So it's
so
so exclusive.
exclusive. Hmm. It's funny. So I love that and I appreciate that, and that matches this moment fully. And it also reminds me of my dad would offer up a fully different word as maybe the worst word in the English language, and he would claim that the worst word is tolerate. And I see a connection between in some ways, because when we view right, if we have this idea that this righteousness of God, that it is exclusive, that it's only for us, that it's only for us in this very limited capacity, then everyone else and everyone who's outside of our own understanding becomes someone that we tolerate. We don't like them, we don't love them, we're not engaged with them, we aren't in community with them, we have no obligation to them, we just sort of like put up with them in a way, right? And this um so let's actually so this Paul sets us up in an interesting way here, and I want to show us. He offers us a a bit of some rhetorical flourish here, and that helps us to actually see um what he's up to, and some of the point that he's trying to prove. If you ever took logic class, if you were a philosophy major like me, or if you remember logic proofs in a math context, Paul is very much going for A, B, therefore C. He's going for, if this is the case and this other thing is the case, then it must be the case. So if we're reading, and I'm going to read to you Romans 8, 1, 18 through 32 to give us a sense of what Paul is after here. So Paul starts off, as we said, by this statement: I'm unashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for the salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith, as it is written, to one who is righteous will live by faith. I'm going to start in verse 13 and read through 32. Listen for what Paul is naming here. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore, God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Keep listening for these vices and brokenness that Paul is naming. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. And we're going to listen for some of these things that are often used as clobber verses and other means of exclusion for especially your LGBTQ siblings, and realize this is in the middle of something Paul is about to undermine fully in just a moment. It says their women exchange natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way, also the men giving up natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. It seems really far afield from where we started with unashamed. We're going to get through with these last four verses to verse 32. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder. We're up to now strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips. It's wild that gossip came like six things after murder, but we're with Paul. We're going. Slanderers, God haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Paul's going. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. Now we'll pause for a minute, because Paul is talking about someone in really harsh terms. We may not even fully understand who he's talking about right now, or if you have a moment of pause to say, like, who is he condemning right now? It's fair, but for a moment, let's acknowledge he is condemning someone and has spent many verses undermining. He's laying it on thick for all of this. He then goes on to say, y'all, and let me pause. I want to actually let you read along with me here as we get into this part of verse 2, because it ends up being, wow. He goes on to say, after saying all of these things, condemning all of these people for all of these behaviors, he then goes on to say, therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with truth. Do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? Time out for a second. Paul set them up with the okey doke. Paul set them up like Muhammad Ali, right? Like Paul set them up like Yogi Bear when he like would spread a sheet over a hole in the forest. Like we fell into it. Paul goes on verse after verse after. We're going to go back to it and look at this a little bit. He talks about how the wrath of God might be revealed and against whom and under what circumstances and how that wrath is deserved for all the things they've done. And Paul goes on to name every bad thing I think a person can do. And you might focus on a few of those things, but I tell you what, Paul hit you with a stone somewhere in here and hit dogs holler. Paul said something about you in here. And then he, again, with this rhetorical flourish, he says, therefore, you have no excuse in judging others. Now, we know, and we're going to go back to the text in a minute, but we know that part of what Paul is actually getting at here is emphasizing, being able to emphasize the importance of God's righteousness. The idea that God's righteousness is actually the thing that makes any of us right or good or together in the first place, and that we aren't able to celebrate our own righteousness apart from God. Like that's what we're going to be diving into for these next weeks and in these next 15 chapters. But thinking that, knowing that that's a lot of the pieces that are ahead, in this moment, Paul is fully trying to set up this idea that our own sense of righteousness or righteousness that we try to generate within ourselves or support within ourselves by, hey, we're doing all the right things and we're avoiding all the bad things. Paul says, time out, you're wrong. Because even if I didn't step on your toes somewhere in verses 18 through 32, even if I didn't call you out in verses 18 through 32, by the time we get to chapter 2 here and start reading, somewhere in here, your own human, flawed, judgmental heart has at some point been guilty of this. Therefore, you have no excuse when you judge others. Paul takes the legs out from under the judging people. He goes on to say, for he will repay according to each one's deeds. To those who, by patiently doing good, seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. While for those who are self seeking, who obey not the truth but wickedness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil. Remember, a few verses ago, he's telling us about how righteousness came first through the Jew, then through the Greek. Now he's telling us there will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. Do you see the parity? Do you see the balance that he's going after? When you I've read this in other moments and other mindsets and not seen it, but when it was first pointed out to me, Paul is working for equality and a parity between his Jewish siblings and his Christian convert siblings. We see it because he's hitting us over the head with it again and again and again. Even in verse 11, for God shows no partiality. I'll pause. I'll pause here for a second. I'm wondering what's standing out to you, and especially wondering if this sounds like what you have heard before, or when you read this before, how it has sounded to you before. I'll trust you're good, but I would love questions if you have questions. I see you, Geraldine.
Well, why is it that I'm the one that says stuff? I want everybody else to talk to.
Me too.
But I'm sorry, I don't like this because I want to cast some stones nowadays.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, tell me more.
well, I mean, come on. I'm a Democrat. I want to cast these stones at Republicans.
Yep.
Or I want to cast stones at Trump
Hmm.
or Stephen Miller because, see, they are being exclusive, you know? And I don't
Right.
want me to be a gossip or someone
Hmm.
else that's in
Hmm.
that list.
Hmm. And like, this is, I would say, this is both something that's really beautiful. It's something that's beautiful about Romans and beautiful about the gospel. Oops. I you may have to turn the volume down on one. Okay, I don't hear the feedback anymore, so I think we're good. This is something that's really beautiful about Romans and also beautiful about the gospel, but it's also something that's challenging about Romans and challenging about the gospel, which is who it lets in. The good and beautiful news is it lets in even us. And the really challenging news is it also lets in the chucklehead who I don't like and who I would rather not deal with, right? and 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 what we're going to see is like Paul gets to a point where Paul does not end in a morally powerless place where, because the righteousness of God is the thing that invites us all in and that welcomes us all and makes room for us all, therefore we can't say anything to anyone, therefore we can't ever say that anything is bad or not of God. Paul gets there, but he gets there first by saying, none of us can stand on our own moral high ground that we have built on our own. None of us are pulling ourselves up by our own two bootstraps. All of us, if we rise at all, we rise upon the gift of God's righteousness. Right. And I want to say a couple things. I, I didn't keep up with my slides, and you may have been following along in the background, but I want to point out the rhetorical flourish, this diatribe, this thing that Paul is doing, that Paul's sort of offering the one thing and then reversing it quickly for them. But really importantly, um, there's a bunch of things in here that are very specific to Paul's first century context. And there's even a moment in there that often is pulled out and used as one of those clobber verses to condemn LGBT people. And it's important that we recognize that that's not Paul's point actually at all in this moment. And in fact, Paul's using all of these things as a way of saying, actually, if you're trying to condemn people for this, you're the one who's making a mistake here. But it's worth noting that and making sure we understand that that's not what Paul is after. And we'll come back to this more in subsequent weeks when we try to understand what is Paul after. And again, Paul doesn't think that every behavior, every attitude, every action is good or permissible or of the gospel. There are places where Paul says, hey, just because when you sin, God's grace is abundant, does that mean you should sin more? Therefore, God's grace will be more abundant? No, like Paul really does have to break it down for us at some points, right? Like, no, don't go out of your way to make more trouble, but don't go out of your way to act in a bad way. But Paul is not condemning um same-sex encounters or relationships, and especially not LGBTQ relationships in the way that we talk about them and think about them today. So we won't be diving in fully to that. If we have questions about that now, we can get into it. We will get into it because some of those other clobber verses are in Romans, and they are not what we often make of them.
So I
This
have a
la
few.
Please, Debbie, yeah, go for it. I'm
Oh
with
yeah.
you. We're here.
Yeah, I have a couple layers here. One
Yeah.
is one is that there's there's so much simplicity to the goodness of Jesus's message. And everything gets a little more convoluted with the self-righteousness to me feels like ego.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of it is that we all have darkness. And if we can accept each other's darkness, I don't know anybody's story, but once I hear their story and I've cast this, you know, judgment on them and they tell me their story, I'm like, okay, that was on me. Not to be able to open my heart to somebody to talk about their ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just think that we're at a time, personally, for me, is that I rather just go kind of that simple kindness path, and everybody has their own stuff, and I can tune it out. I don't have to be triggered by it. If I'm triggered by it, then it's probably something in me. But that's how I kind of work my world a bit. Is just to kind of say, hey, maybe there's more of a story that has happened to them and I'm just being judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that all makes sense, but
No,
the message is
it
simple
does.
to me.
It
Jesus,
mhm,
I just think it's simple. It's kindness and
mhm.
accepting and and
Yeah.
there's a challenge. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to raise my hand and say, I just want to choke somebody. I wish what happened on Saturday ended in a different way. Um, but it doesn't help me. It doesn't help me. And it doesn't
And
help me to go out and get re-energized to do the work of Jesus.
right. It's there's layers to it, and you've pointed at least a couple of those layers. And so let me reflect back. I think what Paul would say, or the language that Paul might use, is uh, to say that we are all relying on God's light to shine. And
Hmm.
if we can recognize, right, that it's God's light that's shining on all of us, we can let each other off the hook and forgive each other for not being the source of light. Because I'm mad at you for not being the source of light I want you to be. Meanwhile, I'm secretly loathing myself for not being the source of light that I want to be. And in reality, we can recognize we were not actually called to be the light. We're called to receive and reflect the light of God. And so if we are less focused on your shortcomings and even less focused on my own shortcomings, we can instead focus on how we can be better reflecting and elevating the light that God gives and shines.
Amen. So it would be that same line, we're all God's children, right? Isn't that
I
kind
think
of that?
it's that same idea, and Paul says it in that way, but he says it in a lot of other ways. And before he gets to the all, he does a lot of the each, which is to the same end of the same goal. But he's naming for this church that has these two big separate constituencies. What we talked about a little bit last week is that for a while, for a decade or more, I believe Jews were kicked out of Rome, so
Mm.
almost all the Jewish people so at one point, most of this Roman church is Jewish, and then for a decade, none of it is Jewish, and then a bunch of people move back, and all of a sudden, some of it is Jewish, some of it is not, but there is a really stark divide in who is here. And so Paul's way of getting to all of us are God's children is first saying, here's the way that righteousness shows up for Jewish people in the Jewish tradition and the Jewish imagination and theology. And here is how God's righteousness shows up in the Christian kind of versions of these things. But this bottom line here is that God, back to this, this lesson piece, that God shows no partiality, that God is not is not trying to layer us or divide us.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's any other pause in this moment? 'Cause there's a couple big things that Paul does, and uh, talking about circumcision for a second, I think probably all might remember that this was an historic practice that was meant to signify Jewishness, that was meant to signify belonging inside of a Jewish community. And before it was any of the things it is in the modern world, it was a sign of belonging. It would be done to newborns on their eighth day, but it would also be done to converts at the right time of conversion. And so there were adult men who were facing circumcision, and that turns out to be a bit of a disincentive in the marketing campaign, right? That is not your leading right point, right? For
Yeah.
recruiting new people. And Paul begins to use this language around circumcision as a way of talking about not physical circumcision, but rather a spiritual circumcision, a circumcision of the heart, he says. So if we talk about physical circumcision, that is a way of surrendering, either your parents or you deciding to surrender both your ability to run away from the moment. You're also surrendering literally a part of your body to be this constant reminder of what you have given up in order to be in a different kind of relationship with God. And Paul engages and tries to push and pull at this idea again, not the supersessionists, not the Christians are better than Jews, but Paul begins to push at this idea that if circumcision is needed, it's not a circumcision of the skin, of the body. If there's something that needs to be cut off, excised, put apart, it's the part of your heart that is hardened towards others. He's doing the same thing that he did a moment ago at the end of in verses 1:18 through 32, and then he kind of stands on top of it all in chapter 2 verse 1 when he says, hey, here's all this brokenness and you have no room to judge. He does it again by saying, sure, cut off all the skin you maybe want to, but what's really necessary is cutting off the parts of your heart that do not serve God. He said, I'm going to share this part of the scripture on the screen so we can review it together. So this is chapter 2, beginning in verse 17. He says, but if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know his will and determine what is best because you are instructed in law, and if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish. Did I tell y'all Paul was trying to write in here? Okay. A corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment and knowledge and truth, you then that teaches others, will you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You that forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you rob temples? You that boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. If Paul's coming for people right now, he's coming for the Jewish Christians who are, as he would say, putting them to shame by their hardness, by saying, hey, you preach all of this, but you're not practicing what you're preaching. You're preaching against stealing, but you steal. You preach against abhorring idols, but if you're going to force people to, if you are going to limit God's righteousness, it's not just about if you're going to force people to get circumcised. It's not just about that. It's if you are going to limit the sense of God's righteousness and the availability of God's righteousness. If God has said it's available for everybody, it's available through the Jews, through the form of the law, it's available to the converts and everyone else through the form of Jesus Christ. If God has said that God's righteousness is available for everyone, you are committing robbery to limit it from anyone. Paul is tearing them up right now, right? And saying we're blasphemed. So he goes on to say, circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. He's not undermining the law. He's not saying there's no place for circumcision. He's not saying there's no place for these historic practices. It's in of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Here is Paul inventing words. Hold on. So if those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law, will not their uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? So if the Gentiles are keeping up with the requirements of the law and embracing God's grace and experiencing God's grace because of it, isn't their uncircumcision a sign of their actual submission to God? Then those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you who have written the code and circumcision but break the law. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is a spiritual and not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others, but from God. Here is a place where we can absolutely apply what he's saying about Judaism to Christianity. Here's room for us to say and understand is even in our current context, right? If you say you're a Christian and you're following all the rules, and yet you act in an un-Jesus way towards your neighbor, towards the people you're called to care for, then you're not actually acting as a Christian, and in fact you're practicing the opposite, that you're creating room for ridicule. um This is different than what many of us have learned. I want to point one more. This will be our kind of our last big piece, and this is kind of what we've been saying the whole time, but in a slightly different way. This idea is not to say, oh, there's darkness all across the land. It's saying God is the source of our light and our righteousness. God is the one who offers justification. Uh, Justice and justification and let's call it being right with God. In fact, I want to play with that phrase for just a little bit. We've heard that forever, right? Oh, I want to get right with God. Is this sort of this right? It's what people say toward the end, or meaning they've got to somehow make recompense or make up for something they've done that's been broken. But here's the funny thing: righteousness is always actually about being right with God. But that's what tells us that God's righteousness has to be dynamic, because what it means for me to be right with God is inherently different than what it means for Debbie or Alex or Kathy or Jared or Lynn or Sarah or anyone else to be right with God. In fact, our own personal circumstance has everything to do with what it means to be right with God, both our own shortcomings and also the places where we have exceeded and reached far and above what anyone might have expected reasonably for us. God sees us and deals with us as individuals. And God's righteousness, as it meets us, it's got to meet us where we are, or it won't meet us at all. Do you see what I'm saying? That God's righteousness isn't this blanket thing that's offered up, and either you reach and grab it or you don't. Instead, God's righteousness, Paul is trying to say, God's righteousness is something that seeks and finds all of us, whether it has to stoop real low or not, whether it's got to go to Centennial or Cincinnati, that God's grace is going to seek and find all of us, because not because of who we are, but because that is how God is. When we talk about that attribute of God, that just way that God is righteous. And what it means for God to be righteous is that God desires to be in right relationship with us no matter what. So if that means that God has to go to great height or great depth, and I'm echoing some language that we're going to hear a little bit later in Romans, if that means God has to go to great distance or great effort, there is no height or depth or length that can separate us from the love of God. And we see that and we understand it through God's righteousness. That this righteousness that sometimes we might hear is this judgmental force or form, in fact, is the way that God's reaching us and meeting us. God's going to make it right between us, whether that means God has to lift us up or God has to come down low. That means that when we see God doing things for the sake of justice, it's not that God is trying to disrupt or punish or anything else, that all of God's actions are the act and living out of God's reconciling things to God's self. God is making it right between us in ways we understand and ways we don't, in ways we might ask for, in other ways we wouldn't. But it's not actually about our preference. It's not about our desire. It's barely about us. It's about God's nature and willingness to keep faith and covenant relationship, even if that means God has to do everything, every part of the relationship that God's righteousness means God is going to make it right with us and between us. And to me, that's the core of the gospel. That's the core of what Paul is trying to get to now and in the future chapters. But it's the thing that we have to keep coming back to. We are wrong if we begin to believe that it relies on us, or that the capacity to be forgiving, let's say, somehow relies on us. Because if it relies on us, I have a finite capacity to be forgiving, and at some point somebody's going to step outside of it. But it's not about my capacity to make things right. It's about God's capacity, right? It's not about whether or not we want our political opponents, whether we agree with them or not. And it's not about what we want for them. It's about what God wants for them and what God's righteousness might want or dictate for them. Right? Like everything that we get to, both our understanding of ourselves in the world and our understanding of other people, all of it rests and swings and hinges on On believing that God's going to make it right with us and between us, whether through the law or through the grace of Jesus, or or any other thing. I'm happy for thoughts, questions, reflections before we kind of put a bow on this. How does that strike you? And especially I'm wondering if that strikes if that if you read it, if that is how you read it, if you read it before, if that's a part of how you've read it before. Yeah. What do we think?
I think Paul has a really strong message and
Mm,
it resonates with me.
mm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
the righteousness word is tripping me up. I
mm-hmm,
would rather say God's grace.
mm-hmm,
It's softer and it works for me.
mm-hmm,
I'd like to find out a little bit more about the circumcision because it's
mm.
like that just got pulled from the sky as a symbol that I don't get it. I mean,
Yeah,
I think it's a stretch to say that you have to, you're giving of your heart, a piece of your heart, and then you go to circumcision. Uh, it's just not, it doesn't it's a strange thing. And if there's a
yeah,
meaning and a uh, a root to that, maybe there's a story that I go, okay, I get it, but
yeah.
I don't
I
get it.
I can tell you, we can do the whole history of it, and where it comes from in the Hebrew Bible, and what it signifies, and even how it continues to be an important part of Jewish faith, right? And all of that can be true, and it is still strange. And I don't mean that in a derisive way, but it is meant to be unique. It is meant to be uh, a sign of being separate or set apart, right?
Mm,
And so no matter how much historical context we give for it, though, it will still be the case and your question will still be valid. Like, hey, is that the way to show us ourselves as set apart? Is that the way to show our devotion to God? And maybe it can be, but to Paul's point, if you say that's the only way, you're wrong, right? If you say that's
yeah.
the only way that God's grace can operate, it's actually it's bigger and fuller than that. Other thoughts, questions, what we've heard, what we've read. I see you, Geraldine.
Um, I'm really glad that I heard what you had to, or I hope I heard what you had to say today, because I'd read the passage before and it never really got through to me what that was all about.
Yeah.
That is that was so helpful to hear, because I'd read what N.T. Wright had said about it,
Mm.
uh, but but I
Do you want
this
to tell
is
us what
just
he
a
says or what you've
brief
yeah.
description. Um, well, he said, well, this is about more about righteousness for
Mm-hmm,
Debbie. The
mm-hmm,
word translated righteousness comes from the Jewish courts, in which there are three parties: the judge, the plaintiff, and the defendant. There is no prosecuting attorney, no defense attorney, no jury. Each party makes his case to the judge, who is called on to be impartial, to punish wrongdoing and support the defenseless, as called for by the covenant. A judge who acts in this way shows his righteousness, his faithfulness in holding up the covenant. When the judge finds in favor of either the plaintiff or the defendant, that party is declared righteous, not morally good and deserving of a favorable outcome, but one who is given the status by the court of
mm,
being in the right as a result of the judge's decision. The problem is that in Greek and English, righteous um, carries moral tones and that are, sorry, old highs, moral tones that are not there in the Jewish court system.
Mm.
Anyway, that's sorry
Yeah.
to
No,
bring,
no.
but that
I want to emphasize. You go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, I just was quite taken with Debbie's comment on righteousness, and
Mm-hmm.
having read this today, that I was like, huh, okay, maybe I'm getting more of what that means.
Right.
Mhm.
And if I can expound on that a little bit, part of what I hear you saying is like we have this moral uh association that we've made or we make with it, this idea that, well, if you're righteous, that means that you are right and have done the right thing. And to a certain degree, Debbie, like the point is, like, especially those like self-righteous people, God's
Right.
righteousness means that nobody else gets to be righteous, right? Not that they're unrighteous, not that they're wrong, but that none of us get to claim that status that Geraldine talked about, like who's the party in court who's decided to be correct. Well, actually none of us. In fact, God is the only one who is righteous. But the good news is whatever happens, God's going to make it right and righteous between us. So
Mm.
God might be, if I'm thinking of a few different instances, right? If like think about when a gold medalist um steps down and puts their medal on like the silver medals, for for pick your favorite reason that this is ever sort of there's this sense in which like God bestows it to us, and it's not about what we've actually done or not done anymore. um yeah.
See,
I want.
when just briefly, when uh, the righteousness is an outside feeling where Paul is saying it's all inside of you, which feels to me not like righteousness, but grace and
Mhm.
faith and belief.
Right.
So
What?
maybe I'm just tripped up with that word.
Yeah, we experience and we feel God's grace
Yes.
when God is bringing God's righteousness to us, or if you or you we might say it differently, or when God is helping us to experience righteousness that we didn't earn. Right? God, that's the sense of
Mm-hmm.
God giving us righteousness that we didn't earn. We call that God's grace. So you're right. You're right in your thinking, and you're right in the connections you make. And I want to share one quick thing with us, and this is at the end of the keynote. I might strategically duck out of the way if you want to take a screenshot or work to remember what next week is going toward. But we're reading through Romans 3 and 4, and if you only have a few minutes to read, here's a couple shorter selections for you to read. But this idea is, I want to say, it's an idea that seems simple. God's grace is forever. No one, no, none is righteous, no, not one. God offers uh grace to us all. Like these are things we say, but sometimes they're kind of trite, and sometimes the power of them is lost. And what I hope we can hold on to now, and especially as we keep reading, Paul is thinking of himself, and he's thinking of the people that he doesn't like, care for, doesn't get along with. That Paul has tussled with Peter. Paul used to travel with Barnabas and not anymore. Remember way back in the day, Paul held everybody's coats while they stoned Stephen to death.
Mm.
So while Paul is talking about God's righteousness making it right, not us, not our own actions, or not our own actions, not the way we followed the law or not, but that God being the one who finds a way to meet us and make it right with us. This is a real idea and a real belief for Paul that matters to him in a personal way. So try to let it meet you in a personal way as well as we read and reflect. And with that, I'll end our recording and say grace and peace and hope to see you next week.
Okay.